Good morning, everyone, and welcome to HealthChats. I am your host, Maribel Ochoa, and today we'll be talking about an important subject, immunizations and the importance of immunizations. But before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsors, Elite Medical, Sain, CVS Caremark, Plantel, and HCP National. A friendly reminder, all questions will be answered at the tail end of today's presentation. If you would like to participate in the Q&A segment, please raise your hand. This feature can be seen at the bottom of your screen. Simply raise your hand and then we will grant you access to go ahead and chat with our lovely Dr. Rosemary Ku. With that, I pass the baton to Dr. Rosemary Ku.
Great. Thank you so much, Maribel. And thank you everyone for joining us today to talk about immunization. I think most of us prior to the pandemic weren't thinking too much about immunizations or vaccines since we get the majority of our shots when we are in our early years of life. But I think with COVID coming around, vaccines are certainly top of mind. And this was a good opportunity for us to not just focus on the COVID-19 vaccine, but really talk about immunizations in adulthood because they are still important to get. And it's a good idea to make sure that you're still up to date on your shots, even as an adult. So today, we're going to be talking about the history of modern immunization. We'll talk a little bit about how vaccines actually work, and then we'll dive into some myth busting of the common myths around vaccines. And at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. And while the presentation, as I mentioned, is not really focused on the COVID vaccine, you're welcome to ask questions about that vaccine at the end of this presentation today. So we'll go ahead and dive in. So for many, many years, there was a process called variolation. And this was kind of the earliest version of immunization. And smallpox was basically the primary target of this because it killed so many people back then. And variolation was basically a process where they took pus from smallpox pustules from one person and scratched it onto the skin of someone else. And that person that was receiving the smallpox germs got a milder form of the smallpox disease, and that was the way in which they built immunity. So they got a more mild version of the disease, and then if they were exposed later on, they'd be able to fight off smallpox. While the smallpox infection after this early form of vaccination was more mild, a lot of people still died. So smallpox in general, if you got a full-blown infection, your chances of dying was 1 in 5. And then with this earliest form of vaccination, your chances were 1 in 50. 1 in 50 is still not great though. And so the doctors at that time were trying to find a better version of vaccination. And Edward Jenner in 1976 is the person who's accredited with starting the modern vaccination process. And the story goes that Edward Jenner in England was observing that milkmaids who got a cowpox version, which is the cow version of smallpox essentially, didn't seem to get smallpox even if they were exposed. So he basically came up with the idea that if you expose someone to cowpox, then they would be immune from getting smallpox, a much deadlier disease, because cowpox didn't really hurt people. And so therefore, he decided to test this theory. And he took some children and he gave them the cowpox germs, and then later exposed them to smallpox and they didn't get sick. So that's one version of the story. And then there's another version of the story where there was another doctor in a nearby town, also in England, who was doing this variolation process, the older process of immunization, where they were actually using smallpox germs and not the cowpox. And this doctor noticed that when he tried the process on some people, they didn't get the sore associated with the smallpox vaccine, and they didn't really get sick from these earlier attempts of vaccination. And yet these people said they never had smallpox, but they clearly had some immunity. And that other doctor noted that the reason why these folks weren't responding to the smallpox vaccination was because they previously had cowpox. So regardless of which story you want to believe or which story is actually the truth and how modern immunization came about, Edward Jenner is accredited with starting the modern immunization movement. And within about 200 years, we were able to eradicate smallpox. And to this day, we still use the word vaccine to describe these solutions that are used to create immunity to diseases. And the root of the vaccine is actually cow. And that's going back to the roots of the earliest vaccinations from smallpox using cowpox. And since then, over the last 2+ centuries, there's been an enormous global impact of vaccines. Originally, even a few hundred years ago, the major diseases that kill people were communicable diseases or infectious diseases. And with the rise of vaccine use, that's actually shifted to now the disease burden is really more chronic conditions that are driven by lifestyle. We're no longer, dying in modern countries from conditions like cholera or viruses, or smallpox. And that's because of the vaccine movement. As I mentioned, we were able to eradicate smallpox, and that's huge. For the world to be eradicated of a life-threatening illness is a major feat. We're also getting pretty close to doing that with polio as well. And the WHO estimates that we save about at least 4 to 5 million lives each year from vaccination alone. And combined with other public health measures such as sanitation, vaccination has been a really important component of increasing our life expectancy. 100 years ago, our life expectancy wasn't really more than 30 or 40 years old. And in that time period, our life expectancy has increased by decades because of vaccination and other modern health benefits. So how do vaccines work? This diagram here shows really simply how the vaccines work, and that they essentially train the immune system to produce antibodies to protect us from viruses or bacteria that can cause these life-threatening or debilitating illnesses. And so even though you don't get sick from the vaccine itself, your body has already been trained to recognize those germs and defend yourself against them when they see them in the real world. In more detail, though, what these vaccines do is they actually train cells called memory B cells, which are a type of white blood cell that can ultimately differentiate into cells that produce antibodies. Now, without memory B cells towards a specific pathogen, such as a virus or bacteria, immunity takes a few weeks to build up. Most of us right now, it's seared into our brains that you don't have full vaccine or full immunity to COVID until after 2 weeks after your vaccination. That's when you're considered fully vaccinated. And we're all very used to thinking about that you're not fully vaccinated until after 2 weeks after your last shot. And that's exactly what's happening. Is it takes, a few weeks for your body's immune system to train itself to be able to develop enough antibodies to defend against a virus or bacteria. But if you've been previously exposed to these pathogens and you have these memory B cells that develop, the next time you're exposed to that germ, it only takes a few days to build up a very significant antibody response. And therefore, you can clear the infection without actually ever getting sick. And that's really the benefit of vaccination, is that it really speeds us this defense process that your body has. And the primary components of vaccines are either inactivated or weakened pathogens. They can also include parts of the virus or bacteria, or as in the case of the COVID vaccine, it can include genetic information that encodes for components of the disease or the virus or bacteria. It can also include modified or weakened versions of toxins that the germs produce. And also, as I mentioned, immunity takes a few weeks to develop. It's not right away. It takes a while for your body to be trained to develop these antibodies. In some cases, it can be lifelong. And if it's not lifelong, we might occasionally need boosters for certain conditions. So go ahead and jump into the myths associated with vaccines. The first is that vaccines are only necessary during childhood. And this is not true. There are several vaccines that we need as adults. Top of mind right now is that we're gearing up for the flu vaccine. Each fall, we start, providing the flu vaccine to our members, and we recommend that for everyone. It's a very easy way to protect yourself from actually a potentially deadly disease. A lot of people don't realize that you can get very sick from flu, and I've seen several cases of young, healthy people land in the hospital or ICU from flu itself. So it's really important to take that additional measure to stay safe during the fall and winter time. It's also important to get your Tdap vaccine, which stands for tetanus, diphtheria, and pertussis. Pertussis is whooping cough, by the way. The Tdap is usually given every 10 years. So this one's a little bit hard to remember when you need it, but your doctor should have your medical records and they should be able to remind you of when you need your Tdap vaccine. Also, if you're pregnant, you need a Tdap vaccine with each pregnancy during your third trimester. And so this also helps protect the baby as well. So it's really important to, especially during pregnancy, to ask your doctor if you're up to date on all your vaccines and if there's anything else you need. Once people hit the age of 50, you also need your shingles vaccine. Now, most of us have had chickenpox, and if you've had chickenpox before, the virus actually stays in your body and can reactivate and cause very painful blisters, and that's shingles. So essentially, the shingles vaccine protects us from that. If you've never had chickenpox before and you've never had the chickenpox vaccine, you may not need the shingles vaccine, but if you don't have immunity to chickenpox as an adult, you should really get the chickenpox vaccine series though. So that's something to discuss with your doctor. Also, as an adult, and this typically applies to people who are over age 65, is that you need your pneumococcus vaccine. And that protects against the wide range of infections that pneumococcus can cause, most notably pneumonia, but also meningitis and sepsis and other infections as well. If you have chronic conditions such as diabetes or lung disease, you might actually need the pneumococcus vaccine before age 65 and then another one after age 65 as well. But again, so these are general recommendations. Depending on your own personal health status and other conditions that you might have, you might need additional vaccines. Also of note, if you didn't get either your human papillomavirus or HPV vaccine as a child or your chickenpox vaccine, you also might be eligible for those as an adult. So talk to your doctor about that. The HPV vaccine is incredibly important for preventing cancers such as cervical cancer and also oral cancers from the HPV vaccine. It also protects you from genital warts as well. So that's actually really important to get even if you didn't receive it as a child. And then lastly, if you haven't been immunized for COVID-19 yet, please call our member services or our United Ag Health and Wellness Centers, and we can get you vaccinated as soon as possible. The second myth that I hear a lot is that if infection rates are low, we don't need vaccines anymore. And this is really not true because we need to maintain herd immunity. Herd immunity typically means that 60 to 70% of the population needs to be protected from an infection to ensure that there is very low risk of the infection becoming endemic in the population. Um, and that's not something you achieve and just celebrate. It's actually something that you have to maintain over time, because there are people, the eligible population that can get infected changes. And so we need to make sure that as much of the population that gets vaccinated for a condition can get fully immunized. And we've seen cases in which vaccination rates have fallen, and then conditions such as whooping cough that have historically been very rare can become much more common as a result of waning vaccine rates. That was actually a headline for us in California several years ago, where there was a huge whooping cough crisis because a lot of parents weren't vaccinating their children against whooping cough because historically the rates of infection were quite low. So it's really important to maintain herd immunity. And then lastly, we live in a global society. Just because we don't have a high rate of infections, for instance, like polio in the US. There's really no polio in the US right now, but we still have to vaccinate our children against it. And that's because in other parts of the country, or other parts of the world, there are places where there are high rates of diseases that we have been able to basically mostly eradicate in the US, but we have to continuously protect ourselves against because there's a lot of travel between countries. And then lastly, some people believe that developing immunity through getting the natural infection is better than getting vaccines, or it's better to get the infection than risk any of the side effects from vaccines. And that's just not true. Natural infection can cause a lot of suffering, disability, or death. And the chickenpox vaccine is a good example of this. So many of us have had chickenpox as a kid, and we were okay. You know, it might have caused some itchy blisters and flu-like symptoms in the beginning, but many of us, you know, survived okay, and it was very common for us to get chickenpox as a kid. But we still ended up developing the vaccine, and now there's a huge vaccination effort for chickenpox because it can actually be deadly in some people, and for adults who are exposed to chickenpox who never have it as a kid, it can actually cause a very severe illness in them. And so natural infection does have its own risks, and typically the risks of the natural infection are much greater than any of the risks from the vaccine itself. And also, especially in the case of the pandemic that we're experiencing right now, vaccines don't just protect you, they also protect your loved ones and community because they dramatically decrease the risk of you getting infected and then spreading to others around you. And so lastly, we just want to remind you of our United Ag resources. We have our health and wellness centers that are able to review your vaccination history and determine what shots you might need and when. So it's really important to have your personalized immunization plan. And we also have Teladoc available to you, as well as CVS Caremark. And before we go into Q&A, I mentioned before that we are gearing up for the flu shot season, and I'll hand it over to Maribel to talk about our efforts at United Ag.
Hello.
Hi, Maribel. Yep, we can hear you now.
Sorry about that. My phone just kicked me out. I apologize. Did you already go over the resources?
I did. Go ahead and you can talk about the flu shots.
Sure. Thank you, Rosemary. Just some quick important reminders. Flu season is around the corner, and there is no better way to prepare than by scheduling your flu shot at your local United Ag Health and Wellness Center, or with your preferred health professional, or any CVS Caremark in-network pharmacy. The flu shots are scheduled to arrive end of September, but I recommend that you pre-schedule. There's nothing wrong with pre-scheduling. And also, if your organization is interested in hosting an on-site flu shot event, we encourage you to contact our client services team, and that is at clientservices@unitedag.org. We are scheduling on-site flu shot events, once again, for the end of September through mid-November. That's all I have.
Great, thanks, Maribel. And we'll go ahead and jump into Q&A. It looks like we have a question here. mRNA vaccines seem relatively new. How do they work differently than other vaccines? That's a great question. So, as I mentioned, there are several different types of vaccine components. There are, ones that contain the virus or bacteria, and then there are others that contain parts of the virus or bacteria itself. So it's not like the whole pathogen, but it's actually the parts of it that are the main ones that our body needs to identify to be able to kill them off. The mRNA vaccines don't contain the actual proteins or sugars of the virus itself, but it contains the genetic code for the main spike protein of the COVID virus. And therefore, it teaches basically our cells to present that a component on our surface of our cells, and it's foreign, and then we actually develop antibodies to that. So it's similar to the vaccines that contain the components of viruses or bacteria, but instead of actually injecting the components themselves, it actually creates the genetic code so that we produce the components, and then our immune system is trained to attack them from there. Great question. Any other questions? Please feel free to either chat in the questions or you can raise your hand and we'll allow you to actually ask your question out loud. Here we have another question. Are vaccines all considered preventative? Yes, I would say they are. That's how they are typically used, is to prevent infection later on. There is a case in which, such as the tetanus vaccine, is that if you are potentially exposed to tetanus, we will vaccinate you as a result of that exposure, such as a cut or something like that. And it's not necessarily meant to treat, even though it's given after the fact that you might be exposed, but it is to actually prevent tetanus infection. So that's one case in which giving the vaccine seems to kind of, the time period might be potentially after the exposure, but it's all really meant to prevent infections. Any other questions?
Don't be shy, guys.
Great, we have another question in here. How long does efficacy last for vaccines? Does it depend on the vaccine? Yes, this does depend on the vaccine, and it also depends on the person themselves. So some vaccines can be lifelong, and others you might need additional booster shots. And so the ones that have scheduled booster shots are meant to be given in series to develop long-term protection from infection. And then in some cases, some people might not develop immunity from the vaccine itself, just because of the way that their own personal immune system reacted. And I'll give you kind of a personal example, is that for me as a child, I got my hepatitis B vaccines, but when you go into medical school, you actually have to show proof that you have hepatitis B antibodies. By that point in time, my immune system no longer had antibodies for hepatitis B. And so that was kind of a personal thing that my body didn't maintain that immunity, even though it should have. And therefore, I had to repeat the hepatitis B vaccine series because of that. So the time period of protection is based on the vaccine and also based on your own personal immune system. Any other questions? Great. Well, these were all wonderful questions. I appreciated you all joining us today, and I'll hand it back over to Maribel for any last announcements.
Thank you, Dr. Ku. Once again, you have a way of explaining such complex information in layman's terms. It really provides great background on the importance of immunizations. And with that, I encourage everyone to join us next month when we will be talking about the importance, or learning more about, should I say, suicide prevention. It's going to be a great topic, and I encourage you once again to attend and recommend HealthChats to your friends, colleagues. The registration is available now, so I encourage you to sign up. That's it for this month's HealthChats, and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you, everyone.